What I'm going to present is work that I've been doing on love and sexuality, taking us a bit away from where we were in the previous paper with the focus on the Christian or theological authorship, although I do wish to bring that into account as well, and focusing on what I see as a fundamental difficulty in understanding Kierkegaard's relation to the notion of love in his authorship, given that he's certainly one of the authors that portrays the sensuous, the sensual, the erotic, with the most vigor in his works of all philosophers. And yet he seems in his later authorship, beginning with works of love, to object to human or erotic love and friendship, while at the same time maintaining that it's not the erotic itself, it's not the human itself, it's not the sensual or the sexual that is drives, desires, lust, even human embodiedness that's really problematic. And given the predominance of the representations of this erotic or sensual in the early texts, the stringent and often critical distinctions between human and erotic love, what he calls elsko, and love of the neighbor, Kärliche, come as something of a surprise when we get to works of love in the authorship. All the more so that more than any philosopher, Kierkegaard attempts to think humanly, that's his own term, about sexuality and the sensuous in his philosophical writings, and to award them their rightful place in his observations of human existence. Within the context of 19th century medical, legal, and religious literature, one must note that it is quite remarkable that Kierkegaard, in the concept of anxiety, explicitly writes, and he writes it 10 times, that sexuality is not sinfulness. And although he is critical of erotic and preferential love and desire, opposing these in works of love to love of the neighbor, as I've said, he never articulates the critique in terms of abnormality or deviance, as was often the case in 19th century writing. I want to stress that Kierkegaard goes directly against dominant trends in medical, legal, political, and religious discourse of the 19th century, which defined all forms of sexuality, not directly oriented toward procreation as perversion. And although Kierkegaard does make, of course, the problematic claim that ethically woman, I quote, under her ideal aspect is procreation, end quote, suggesting that procreation might be the highest aim of human sexuality, he importantly does not make the opposite claim that sexuality or sensuousness not directed toward these ends is sin. To the contrary, he deliberately mocks the standard views of his times, criticizing the value of procreation and its relation to marriage, as well as the dominant social view that unmarried people are somehow deviant, as in a notebook entry where he evokes people's views that doctors should be married, since patients might fear that an unmarried doctor would be a lecherous person. In his late papers from 1854, Kierkegaard critiques with vigor the, I quote, kind of orthodoxy that is connected with the cordial rubbish of family life, end quote, and which, I quote, constitutes the worst danger for Christianity, and not wild lusts, extravagances, terrible passions, and the like, end quote. So this might seem trivial and a bit of a digression, yet I would suggest that it has tremendous consequences, and that it's precisely what Kierkegaard does not say about sexuality that can open up to new ways of reading, his distinction between erotic love and love of the neighbor. To set the stage for this analysis, I'd like to offer a brief foray into historical context. In 1758, the Swiss physician Samuel Auguste Tissot published an influential volume that would have lasting impact on the medical and scientific community. The topic of the work was a, I quote, deadly illness, perhaps more ravaging a corruption than smallpox, end quote, and more dangerous because its workings were silent and mysterious. The disease in question was masturbation. Referencing a long tradition of medical observations from Hippocrates to Galen to his own and his contemporaries, Tissot explains in this work, a very long work, moreover, how the waste of bodily excretions through masturbation and nocturnal pollution leads to weakness, blindness, madness, premature death, and just about every conceivable pathology in between, including loss of memory and intellectual faculties, insomnia, rheumatisms, melancholy, and other bodily dysfunctions. Although Tissot admits that not everyone who engaged in this, I quote, odious and criminal habit, end quote, comes to a miserable and premature end, he notes that no one is exempt from its negative effects. Women are particularly concerned as well, despite Tissot's attempt to describe the squandering of seminal fluids as the cause of loss of force and health, and are even subject to specific pathologies such as hysteric fits and vapors, or what Tissot describes as, I quote, uterine furies that take away at once their modesty and their reason, placing them, that is women, at the level of the most lascivious brutes until a despairing death tears them from their pains and infamy, end quote. Though not immune, of course, to moralizing discourse, I think you've heard that, Tissot's work is not a theological or a moral treatise. It contributes to making masturbation and questions about sexuality, more generally, a question of public health policy. Throughout the 19th century, the medical community followed Tissot's lead, decrying onanism or self-pollution as the cause of human suffering, increasingly making the argument against masturbation a case for psychiatry and public health measures. Though critical of the predominant discourse, the French physician Léopold Deslandes writes in 1835 that there is almost unanimous agreement in the medical community of his times about the dangers of onanism, and cites one of his contemporaries, Monsieur Réveillé-Paris, according to whom, I quote, neither the plague nor war nor smallpox has more disastrous results for humanity than masturbation, end quote. While Heinrich Kahn's 1844 Psychopathia Sexualis broke away from religious understandings of masturbation, homosexuality, and other sexual concerns about sexuality, generally perceived as sins, to present them fully as mental disorders, other physicians such as R.J. Brodie wholeheartedly took up a moral condemnation of sexual deviance on humanitarian grounds. Brodie writes in 1845 that, I quote, nothing weakens the mind so much as pernicious practices, end quote, and that it's necessary to abandon, I quote again, those baneful habits which sap, undermine, and destroy the foundation of all human happiness, end quote. He argues that his aim is to, I quote again, show by incontrovertible proofs the manifold evils society endures by licentiousness and unrestrained indulgence of the passions, end quote. Masturbation, he writes, is a passion that captivates the imagination of its victim imperceptibly, step by step, till every moral feeling is obliterated and all the physical powers destroyed, end quote. The discourse on the dangers of masturbation had made its way through the scientific and medical communities from the United States to Russia during the first decades of the 19th century, including Denmark, where the Kierkegaard family physician, Olof Lundt-Bang, would notably include in his 1852 Handbok i Terapien, Handbook on Therapy, a section on spermatorrhea, that is excessive involuntary ejaculation, citing masturbation as the cause of a plurality of ills from fatigue to impotence, melancholia, or suicide. So this may seem like a digression from our topic, but I wish to stress the necessity of taking into account this very general understanding of and how precisely radical Kierkegaard's writings may appear in light of these medical discourses of his times. His claim that sexuality is not sinfulness goes against pretty much every dominant trend in thought. And this raises an obvious question. Why does he come to reject sexuality anyway, or at least seemingly to reject sexuality anyway in his later writings? What's wrong, at least potentially, with erotic love? A starting point for responding to this question may be found in the concept of anxiety, where after stating that the sexual as such is not the sinful, Kierkegaard writes that it may become sinful with the introduction of what he calls generic difference, which becomes manifest as the sexual drive. In generic difference, the human being is determined as male or female, determined as man or woman. Although Kierkegaard is not very explicit in his explanations here, he suggests that what sexual drive posits is the possibility of seeing others differently, despite the fact that in reality, this determination, or I quote, difference is not such that man and woman are essentially not alike, despite the dissimilarity, end quote. Yet as he suggests and demonstrates through his literary portrayals, the essential sameness between all human beings may not be what we see when sexual drives and inclinations enter into our lives, opening up to the possibility for being viewed by others and by ourselves even as differentiated bodies, and more problematically as objects, a term that Kierkegaard frequently uses, objects of love, objects of worship, objects of possession, objects of desire in more modern terms. Sexual desire not only differentiates, it can lead one to fail to see the subjectivity or the humanity in another or in himself. It can lead us to treat others as means or as objects. And Kierkegaard hints at this, giving the example in the concept of anxiety of what happens when a person, I quote, fastens his desirous glance upon another, and then he elicits certain feelings, negative responses of indignation, disgust, or shame. And Kierkegaard further notes that although sexuality is not sin, sexuality introduces the possibility of guilt. Yet if guilt is not in sexuality itself, in the drives or inclinations that Kierkegaard repeatedly stresses are not the problem, or in sexual acts, wherein does it lie? While the Dane is rather laconic on this issue, I suggest that he is pointing to the fact that sexuality poses really the dangers of objectification. And given the current World Health Organization estimates that 30% of the world's women are victims of sexual or physical violence because they're women, and it's certainly obviously not a problem that uniquely pertains to women, this is and remains a real and serious problem. In other words, it introduces the possibility of relating to others wrongly, perhaps by projecting fantasies and intentions upon them, or desiring to seduce with no real consideration for the other's interest. And also the possibility of relating to oneself wrongly, of not being able to relate to oneself at all except as other, as in Kierkegaard's poignant descriptions of the misfortune of being a woman in Stages on Life's Way, passages to which, moreover, Simone de Beauvoir refers in her construction of the problem of woman or the female in the second sex. I quote Kierkegaard here, that in actuality she signifies less than man is not her misfortune, even less if she were to find out about it, for that, of course, can be endured. No, the misfortune is that her life in the romantic consciousness has become meaningless. Thus, one moment she means everything, nothing at all in the next, yet without ever finding out what significance she actually does have. And still, this is not the misfortune. It is mainly that she cannot come to know it because she is a woman. For my part, if I were a woman, I would rather be one in the Orient, where I would be a slave, for to be a slave, neither more nor less, is still always something compared with being a hurrah and nothing, end quote. So I'd like to turn now to works of love and its well-known distinction between erotic love and love of the neighbor. And to note again, that at no point does Kierkegaard claim that what might be problematic about erotic love is its sensual or its sexual characteristics. Indeed, he specifically affirms that, I quote, Christianity does not want to abolish drives or inclination, end quote. Yet, of course, drives and inclination can be problematic if sexual drives lead us to the wrong type of relations with others, erroneously understanding as love what is really, I quote, weak compliance, pernicious whining, harmful alliance, or conceited behavior, or self-seeking connections, or the bribery of toadyism, end quote. Erotic drives may be harmful. They can lead one to ignore one's own or the other's best interest. They can lead one to treat oneself or the other as a means to an end. They can lead to acts of manipulation, such as seduction or flattery. Works of love evokes the Christian duty to love one's neighbor as oneself, of course, but also points to the many flaws in the typical ways in which we generally relate to others in our very human lives. What is problematic with erotic love or friendship is that it is preferential, that it is changing, that it makes exceptions. What is problematic is that it may be deceptive or possessive, that it may turn out to be nothing other than self-love. What is problematic is that it imposes conditions, demands reciprocity or reward, that it seeks its own. What is problematic is that it can incite us to fail to see the fundamental similarity and equality of others, first and foremost as human beings, before becoming those particular others whom we love. All of these critiques, and I'm going over this rather quickly, but I'm sure those of you who are familiar with works of love see this vocabulary and these references, are both simultaneously instinctively understandable and at times a bit extreme, and Kierkegaard scholarship has often commented these extremities. One might ask, after all, what precisely is wrong with reciprocity, which is one of the foundations of our moral engagements with others? What's wrong with preference? Should we not favor, if not in our actions, at least in our hearts, our relations to our friends, to our partners and our children? Do we really have to come to hate, whatever interpretation we may give to that term, our father and our brothers, our family, in order to relate properly to others, as Kierkegaard sometimes claims? Do we really have to set aside our own interest to love and serve our neighbor? Is, as Kierkegaard claims, quote, the truly loving person, the one who loves all without demanding reciprocal love, end quote? While we may very well readily agree that demanding reciprocity is by no means a loving attitude, and indeed not true reciprocity at all, the desire to be loved by particular others, to be recognized and seen as we are by those others, does not necessarily entail the lack of a loving attitude. I would suggest that what Kierkegaard rightfully finds problematic with erotic love is that it potentially seeks other ends than the fulfillment of its aims, its lovings, be they sexual, sensual, or otherwise. It may seek ends such as power, validation, or possession. Kierkegaard was especially critical of the ideals of marriage and procreation of his day, writing in his papers about the way in which family can become a means of gaining power and control. I quote, most people lack the self-esteem to be able to assert themselves directly vis-a-vis others. So their self-esteem requires that they have some people who must obey them unconditionally, whom they have entirely in their power, so that they too can feel themselves to be rulers. These, then, are the children, end quote. While love can be used and abused for power and control, it can also be abusive to those who seek to be loved by others. It can make us become the victims of our own desires, to lose sight of our own humanity through our desire to be validated or adored. In a passage from Works of Love, Kierkegaard writes, and this is a very long quote, I'm sorry, but I think it's very important. I quote, there are people who have inhumanly forgotten that everyone should fortify himself by means of the universal divine likeness of all people, have forgotten that therefore, whether a person is a man or a woman, poorly or richly endowed, master or slave, beggar or plutocrat, the relationships among human beings ought and may never be such that one worships and the other is worshipped. This is so easy to perceive that one might think that this abomination can originate only from a misuse of superiority, that it is only with the superior person. Alas, it can originate also with the powerless person, who himself desires it in this way to have an importance of sorts for the superior one. Take away eternity's equality and its divine rehabilitation, that is, assume that it is forgotten. Then the vulnerable woman in relation to the arrogant man, the poorly endowed and yet vain individual in relation to the richly endowed, the poor and the yet only worldly concerned in relation to the all-powerful man. They themselves desire this abomination, desire it with every passion. Their desire is to exist for the powerful person. Then abasement becomes what is desired. End quote. I think that Kierkegaard was acutely aware of the fact that our relations to others may become perverted, which is not to say perverse, through our desires and through our failure to recognize and love ourselves and others in the right type of way. I suggest that the distinction between erotic and Christian love be read not as a rejection of the erotic or the sensual or of our normal human loves, but rather as an appeal to the type of attitude that is required if we are to relate to ourselves and our loved ones rightly. Kierkegaard's affirmation that our relations should never be those of a worshipper to one who is worshipped is a strong reminder of the fact that there can be no love without a fundamental recognition of the equality between individuals. Our desires and inclinations are not themselves what are harmful. What does become dangerous is when they lead us to see others as objects for satisfaction. And thus they incite us to deceive ourselves and others. In works of love, Kierkegaard seems to be affirming that it's only through a Christian perspective, that it's only through a prior relation to God, that only seeing love as a divine duty, that one can escape the pitfalls of our natural human tendencies. The position he adopts has been the object of many critiques from Adorno and Leustrup to contemporary scholars like Karl Verstringe, of what some term an inhuman or inhumane perspective detached from life, and also many defenses, as in Jamie Ferrer's excellent analysis in Love's Grateful Striving. So I don't wish to go here into detail about these multiple readings or into theoretical debate about Kierkegaard's theological positions. What I do wish to suggest is that these debates and the particular form of these discourses ought not to lead us to overlook what is particularly radical for Kierkegaard's times and still pertinent today about Kierkegaard's analysis of erotic love and sexuality or sensuality. In Kierkegaard's Psychology, Kerstin Nordentoft wrote in 1972 that, I quote, "In spite of his radical criticism of the attitude of Christianity and moralism toward the sexual, Kierkegaard does not begin a campaign for sexual liberation," end quote. Taking into account, however, the historical context, the medical legal discourse on sexual perversions, and the prevailing social norms of his day, including gender norms, I would argue to the contrary that this may precisely be what Kierkegaard, in his own discreet way, does. He encourages us to understand that sexuality itself is not a sin, that pleasure and desires are not reprehensible, that love should not be an excuse for domination, possession, subjugation, or fulfillment of selfish desires. It should never demand reciprocity or allow for individuals to put their own interest before that of others. It should never make us forget our own self-worth and give up our integrity. It should never make distinctions of class or status. To the contrary, we need to come to understand that what we receive from others is something that we are never owed, but always a gift that is freely given. And the freest love, as Kierkegaard reminds us in the discourse on recollecting the one who is dead, is the love which is present in the absence of any compelling or any extortion. I quote from Works of Love, "The child cries, the pauper begs, the widow pesters, deference constrains, misery compels, etc. But any love in work that is extorted in this way is not free. The stronger the compelling, the less free is the love," end quote. Works of love seems to suggest that all human love necessarily becomes selfish and demanding. Yet if it's not our nature and natural urges, our drives and inclinations that lead us to objectify others and subject them to our own ends, what is it? I suggest the answer to this question may not be found in works of love, but rather in Stages in Life's Way, where Kierkegaard offers a very poignant and modern critique of what's wrong with the ways in which we project figures and stereotypes onto others, construct sex and gender roles, and transform human beings into categories, men and women, through our social practices. The passages I'm referring to are the analysis of gallantry, which Victor Eremita describes as, I quote, conceiving in fantastical categories the person toward whom one is gallant, end quote, whereas Johannes the seducer, unsurprisingly, qualifies them as natural language. Gallantry is the language of conventions, a mode of relating and acting that fails to address the other as a concrete, specific person, but rather dresses her in illusions, deludes, and deceives. It makes a life, I quote, point to meaningless, end quote. It points to abstraction and to negativity. It construes the other fictitiously, patterning modes of behavior and presentation or representation. And woman's misfortune, to come back to this theme, Eremita suggests, is that she is so embedded in the practices and discourse about the feminine that she's not even able to see that this constitutes her misfortune. As Simone de Beauvoir later emphasized, she is defined by the negativity of her relation, which she accepts as the only means of asserting her value and claims to existence. One is not born a woman or a man, one becomes a woman or a man, not through a biological process, but through a complex social one. Though there may not be oppression, gallantry and social conventions prevent one from relating to one's own life in an earnest, authentic, and positive manner. And it may have the perverse effect, Kierkegaard notes, of making one accept to be subjected, even ardently desire to be dominated, worshipped, unable to, I quote, ever shed the illusion with which life has consoled one, end quote. So just by way of conclusion, even though I've gone a bit beyond perhaps the traditional Kierkegaard, what I wanted to show is the ways in which perhaps Kierkegaard might be a more relevant thinker for some of these modern questions than we often ascribe to. And obviously, I'm leaving out a large part of the Christian and the theological aspects of his writing. But I think Kierkegaard does point discreetly to something and to ways in which we may be able to change, to move beyond our standard traditional readings of sex, gender, understandings of what love is, and point to things that are important, as Kierkegaard says, for thinking humanly about human love and human desires and human sexuality. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to try to answer any questions or hear your comments and remarks.